I got some sleep, but I'm just tired in general. All right. Well, I could use 15 hours of sleep. Um, the new PowerPoint is still uploading to Canvas right now because it's kind of a large file. So that should be done in the next couple of minutes here. And then, let me pull this up over here. Okay. So, today, first of all, I hope you all had a restful break. First time I've seen you guys since before we went to Thanksgiving break last, or 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago. So welcome back, and we are closing out this semester with beginning World War I. And we will finish it right around the time we take finals. So World War I is the next major unit that we are learning about in world history. And so let's go ahead and get started with that. All right. So, World War I. I know it says AP Euro, but just ignore that. World War I. We've been making our way through the age of imperialism, and the age of imperialism resulted in. Actually, I should probably keep it like this so I can see the comments. Let me do this. So the age of imperialism resulted in the rise of nationalism. And we've been talking about nationalism now in this class, really going back to Napoleon. All right, we learned about the rise of nationalism when Napoleon, at the end of the French Revolution, which is the third unit in this class, we learned that Napoleon, really his major downfall was that he could not force people who didn't feel French to, just capitulate to his demands and go along with his rule. It didn't matter how powerful his military was in Austria, in Spain, in Russia, wherever, because he couldn't make people feel French. He couldn't make people feel loyal to him. And that's really the first time that we kind of get introduced to nationalism in Europe in this class. Also, we've talked about nationalism as a function of imperialism, where we talked that, basically these nations were competing with one another to try to acquire as much territory, as much colonies overseas as they could. And so these European nations are really developing this nationalistic sentiment, this nationalistic pride or prestige, where they feel very, very, zealous, very joyful over their national identity, whether it be French or British or German or Russian or anything else. These nations that have developed, have been oddly, kind of able to keep the peace with one another for some period of time, with only a couple of examples of conflict during the age of imperialism, where we learned about the Boer War. We also learned about the Sepoy Mutiny, but that was more of a colonial dispute with India. Okay, we learned about the Opium War, once again kind of a colonial dispute, but kind of miraculously, throughout much of the age of imperialism, European nations managed to avoid going to war with one another. And and that's not something that Europe has been traditionally very good at. Europe's much better at going to war than they are staying out of war, historically speaking, that is. And so there's a lot more times in history where we can point to failed abilities to keep the peace, but it seems that in the age of imperialism, for a good 30 years or so, they're able to pretty well keep the peace, from about 1870 all the way up until about 1900 or so. And but it's going to ultimately result in World War I breaking out. And what's crazy about World War I, we think of World War I as having happened so long ago now. It's a distant memory. World War I and the people that participated in it, and the goals of the war itself and so on, seem very far removed from the modern world that we live in today. But make no mistake, the thing that's kind of tricky about history is that no one really predicts these things are going to happen. Wars, you want to avoid them if at all possible. But World War I kind of gets started from a number of different coinciding factors that all happen at once, and we're going to talk about those today. So the general rule of thumb about learning the causes of World War I, which is really what we're focusing on today, is like, how did this war happen? How did World War I come about? They had been peaceful for the most part. European nations had not been going to war with one another. They had been competitive, but not, fighting in any conflicts for some time. So how does World War I happen when, seemingly they would want to avoid war if at all possible? How does something like this happen? Well, the main trick to remembering World War I's causes the main trick to remembering World War I's causes is called mania. Okay, mania, M-A-N-I-A. Mania is, of course, an acronym that you can use to remember the following terms. Okay, so what are the causes of World War I? M, militarism. Now, I just have to warn you that as I go throughout this PowerPoint, militarism, it doesn't go really in order. Okay, mania is just to help to remember them all, but this PowerPoint doesn't really go in order of them. There's reasons that I talk about alliances first, but mania, militarism, alliances, okay, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. This is what mania stands for, so I'll go over it again. M, militarism. A, alliances. N, nationalism. I, imperialism. A, assassination. All right? And that gives you the major big ideas as to how World War I gets started. Okay, some of these causes of World War I, for example, alliances and imperialism and nationalism, are what we would call long-term causes. Okay, and then there are some of them that are more short-term causes of World War I, and that would be like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, June 28th, 1914, I think it was. Okay, so long-term causes of World War I. Let's look at this system of alliances that starts to develop in Europe. And these alliances are going to be very important for understanding how this war happens, because the alliances are a big part of how all of these nations get drawn into the war. All right, so they're basically in Europe at this time. There's kind of two developing major factions of rival alliances, what we call the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Okay, and these two rival alliances started developing quite early in the 1870s. So here's the deal. Let's talk a little bit about Germany. The last we talked about Germany, we might have been calling it Prussia. Okay, Prussia was what Germany was known as before it became Germany, and that's because Germany, all the way up until 1870, which, was not that long ago if we're really thinking about it in terms of history, all right, all the way up until 1870, Germany had been kind of a fragmented system of independent principalities and territories that were not really unified. Okay, so Prussia was the largest of about 30 some different German states in what was known as the German Confederacy, or the German Bund, B-U-N-D. Okay, and this German Confederacy meant that Germany was not a single unified state until 1870, when Prussia, which was leading the way for German unification, ended up entering into a war with France. So Prussia and France go to get war against one another, and in this conflict, which is known as the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia comes out victorious. Not only that, they actually completely they capture the leader of France at the time, whose name was Louis Napoleon III, okay? Louis Napoleon III, and they capture him. He's taken out of power. France is humiliated by this defeat, and Prussia is feeling quite good about themselves. The leader of this German unification movement was a brilliant politician who we've mentioned in class before. He was the leader of what was known as the Berlin Conference, which we learned about last unit. The Berlin Conference was where different European nations got together at this meeting in Berlin, and the leader of the meeting was Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was the, undisputed political mastermind of Europe in the late 1800s. Otto von Bismarck was a truly brilliant politician, and he managed to use the political situation in Europe almost like a chess game, where he was always 2 or 3 steps ahead of every other player in the game. And so they go to war with France in part because there's some territories that Germany wants to claim that France held. And Bismarck was, fearful that the French would try to exact revenge on Prussia for defeating them so badly in the Franco-Prussian War. And so what Bismarck does after he defeats the French in this war is he tries to isolate France. And this ends up resulting in these 2 alliance systems forming, basically. Because what happens is when Bismarck tries to isolate France, the way that he goes about doing this is he also feared Russia. And what ends up happening is that he makes a deal with Russia to try to isolate France, and then also makes a deal with Austria, who the Germans had actually defeated in a different war back in about 1865 or something like that, 1863 maybe. Okay, and in 1879, Germany and Austria developed this. They developed this alliance with one another. And remember that shouldn't be too surprising because Germany and Austria are both German-speaking nations. They're culturally both German. And so it makes sense that Germany and Austria, who had a lot of historical animosity with one another, ultimately would find common ground in their culture, in their nation, all right, German background. And kind of be able to bury the hatchet a little bit between their previous disputes with one another. So Germany and Austria end up on the same side. Bismarck doesn't want to see Russia expanding into Austrian territory. And this dual alliance was based on German support for Austria in its struggle with Russia over expansion in the Balkans, which is in this, if you're looking at this map of Europe in the background, the Balkans is down in this region over here. And the Balkans are going to play a very important role in World War I because the Balkans are basically right where the whole war starts to explode, and then it spreads across all of Europe and then really all of the world. So the Balkans are going to play a very important role in learning about World War I. But anyhow, the reason I'm kind of setting up these alliances so intricately is because it helps when you understand some of the political reasons why these alliances were formed in the first place. So why does Germany and Austria reach out and form an alliance with one another? Well, they're culturally similar, and because they both have a vested interest in preventing Russia from expanding down into these territories in the Balkans here. This is in red, this is Austria here. Austria is also trying to expand into these territories, and Germany's okay if Austria does it, but they don't want to see the Russians do it. So, now, Italy ends up joining in this alliance, okay? Italy ends up joining in this alliance, and I need to emphasize right now that this is a pre-World War I alliance, okay? So, and the reason that I am emphasizing that is because when the war actually starts, we see some changes to the alliances. Okay, when the war actually starts, Italy, for example, which was in the Triple Alliance, ends up switching sides. Okay, and I'll talk about that later. But for right now, Italy is in the Triple Alliance. So who was in the Triple Alliance? The Triple Alliance is a pre-war alliance. When the war actually starts, the alliances change, all right? But in the Triple Alliance leading up to the war, Italy joined Germany and Austria because Italy was looking for support for its imperialistic ambitions in the Mediterranean and in Africa. And remember that Italy had famously been defeated by Menelik II in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia retained its independence from Italy during the age of imperialism as a result of that. So, what happens with Germany and Russia? All right. Basically, right before Otto von Bismarck is essentially retires, okay, or is fired, okay. Right before Otto von Bismarck is fired, he reaches out to Russia and doesn't ask for Russia to join their alliance per se, but instead negotiates kind of a separate deal with Russia. And it was known as the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887. And basically what this agreement was between Russia and Germany was that both sides promised to stay neutral if either side went into war with another country. So what this was supposed to do was to prevent, you can see here once again in the background, Germany is in blue here. Russia is over here to the east. Okay, France is over here to the west. And one of the things that Germany doesn't want to do in World War I is fight a war on both sides of their country. So Bismarck, being a brilliant mastermind politician, Bismarck, before he died, and by the way, this is not Bismarck in the background. We'll get to who that is in just a second here. All right. Bismarck is concerned about Russia, and he doesn't want, if Germany ends up going back to war with France, he doesn't want Russia joining in and helping France out. Pretty smart dude, if we're being honest, okay, to have that level of foresight to say, hey, you know, we got to make a deal with Russia. We won't make them our allies per se, but we'll make this agreement that basically says that if either of our nations go to war, we'll remain, the other will remain neutral. And so he reaches out, he makes this deal, but there was a big mistake, and that was when Kaiser Wilhelm II, and that's who's in the background up there, Kaiser Wilhelm II refused to renew the Russian neutrality treaty, reinsurance treaty, after firing Otto von Bismarck in 1890, just 3 years after the treaty was signed. So Bismarck, when he signs this treaty, okay, he's making a deal with Russia that both nations will remain neutral, and not go to war against the other if either of them get into a conflict. But Kaiser Wilhelm II has no concerns about that from Russia. And so he refuses to renew this treaty. And this can be seen as a huge diplomatic blunder because Russia actually really wanted to renew this neutrality treaty. And Germany, now out of necessity, developed even closer ties to Austria because there was no hope of them reconciling this neutrality treaty with Russia. And France ends up courting Russia, and the two of those countries now become allies. So what has essentially happened here, to use the map in the background, all right? What's up, Karan? So what has essentially happened here, to use this map in the background, you've got Germany. When Germany was under the control of Otto von Bismarck, they made a deal with Russia that would basically mean that these two nations wouldn't have to worry about going to war with one another. And note that they do border one another, so that's a pretty big deal. When Kaiser Wilhelm II takes the throne, he fires Otto von Bismarck, and afterwards, Kaiser Wilhelm II refuses to renegotiate that treaty with Russia. And instead what happens is that Russia reaches out all the way over here to France and makes a deal with France. So now, thanks to not renegotiating that treaty with Russia, Germany is now faced with having to tie itself closer to its only ally, Austria, and Italy, I guess, okay, but mostly Austria. And then France and Russia now have the potential to go to war on either side of Germany, which would mean that Germany would have to split its forces in half and fight on either side of the nation. And that is not ideal. That's really bad for Germany, okay? Because that was exactly what Otto von Bismarck was trying to avoid having happen. So now we see the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary. So Austria-Hungary was a dual monarchy. That's why it has two names. So Austria-Hungary was the actual title of it, okay? Austria-Hungary, and then Italy, all right? Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy are in the Triple Alliance, all right? Britain, France, and Russia over here are in what's known as the Triple Entente, all right? So, why is this so significant? When the war starts, all right, we are going to see some changes. After the war begins, they are no longer called the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. When the war begins, the Triple Alliance, okay, these ones right here in this kind of pink color, okay, or red, all right? These three nations, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, become known as the Central Powers because they are in Central Europe, okay? So the Triple Alliance turns into the Central Powers, except for Italy switches sides. So Italy drops out. So these nations, after the war starts, are no longer known as the Triple Alliance. They start to be known as the Central Powers. And they actually bring down here the Ottoman Empire ends up joining with the Central Powers. But for the most part, we just think of the Central Powers as being Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy, on the other hand, switches sides. And after the war begins, Britain, France, and Russia are no longer known as the Triple Entente. They become known as the Allied powers. Now, the reason that that's so confusing, all right, the reason that that's so confusing, here, let me just do this really quick. Insert text box. Okay. No, they did not have concentration camps in World War I. Okay. So, once again, here's the reason it's confusing. You would think the Triple Alliance would rename themselves the Allied powers, right? But they don't. It's the Triple Entente that becomes known as the Allied powers, and the Triple Alliance becomes known as the Central powers. I know that that's unnecessarily confusing, but that's just how it is, okay? So, how does the Triple Entente get formed? Well, we're going to talk about it. Britain, for a long time, was in this period of time known as splendid isolation, as they called it. The idea basically being that, yes, Ricardo, yes, they are. Are these slideshows going to be on? It should already be there now. I uploaded it already, so yeah, it's in the, if you go to Canvas and you go to Files and you go to Lecture PowerPoints, and it'll be right here, okay? It's already up there for you. Okay, so splendid isolation for Britain. Basically, Britain was in this period of time where they really were trying to just manage themselves, all right, and their giant colonial empire. So after 1891, in Europe, Britain was basically the only non-aligned power. And this is because Britain very much viewed themselves as, you know, kind of like an exception to the rest of Europe, okay? The British, I don't know if you've ever heard of this phrase, British exceptionalism, where the British think of themselves as better than everyone else, which, you know, is frankly the symptom of most nationalism, regardless of where it comes from. But anyway, the British have a tendency to be a little bit separate from the rest of Europe, and we've recently seen this again with Brexit. You guys may have heard something about Brexit, where Britain has left the European Union, and that is a really significant thing in history. We will be teaching that in history books in not too long a time, because it's concerning, really, okay? It's concerning. The British becoming more isolated, the British becoming more isolated is a concerning matter to me, precisely because of World War I history. It's not good when nations become nationalistic and isolationist. It usually spells disaster. But after 1891, Britain was the only non-aligned power. The first nation that Britain actually reaches out to create an alliance isn't even a European nation. It's Japan. So the first indicator that Britain was ready to kind of tip its hat towards joining one of these alliances was when Britain sought Japanese agreement to benevolent neutrality to counter a possible Russian threat in India. And this was the end of Britain's splendid isolation period, where they had basically just been kind of like doing whatever they wanted. And then they enter into the Entente Cordiale, okay, the cordial entente. If you've ever heard of what it means to be cordial with someone, if you're being cordial, imagine, I'll give you a situation where a person would be cordial. A situation where a person would be cordial is if you're like, let's say like your ex-boy or girlfriend ends up meeting someone new, and then somehow you end up, like meeting them at a party or something like that. You'd probably be cordial. You're not gonna be real buddy with them. You know what I mean? It's not gonna be something where you really feel like, oh my gosh, we're kindred spirits or something like that. But you'll probably be polite, okay? I mean, it's one of those things where it's like you'll shake hands, you'll kind of do the old head nod, and then move on with your life. That's kind of what it means to be cordial, right? So this Entente Cordiale is in the face of Anglo-German naval arms race, which was happening at this time. We'll talk about what that, it's all that means is the English-German Navy buildup that was occurring during this time. Britain and France settled all their outstanding colonial disputes in Africa. Remember that Britain and France historically have not gotten along with one another, okay? The British and the French fought like cats and dogs all the way through the 1700s and really even into the 1800s, okay? I can name for you at least 5 different wars that we've talked about in this class that the British and the French have found themselves on opposite sides of. So that's why when we say this is a cordial alliance, they're not doing it because they're best buddies, okay? They're not doing it because they look at each other as being so similar or having some sort of shared history with one another, okay? They're doing it for means of practicality. The British and the French historically have not gotten along with one another, but in this scenario, they're going to agree to get along with one another and be cordial with one another because they're both concerned about the German Navy buildup that's happening at this time that threatens to put both of them out of existence. And so Britain and France settle all of their previous disputes that they had in Africa, particularly in the area of the Sudan, which we had talked about during the imperialism unit, how the British and the French fought over the region of Sudan. And Britain recognized French control of Morocco and gave, kind of gave up their colonial interests there. And so what ends up happening is the Triple Entente is formed in 1907, and this was Britain, France, and Russia. And really the whole reason that the Triple Entente gets formed is as a reaction to the Triple Alliance, which had come first. So as soon as Britain, France, and Russia take a look at this Triple Alliance that had developed, and in the face of Germany building up its navy and becoming more militaristic and stuff, Britain, France, and Russia are all fearful now of what could happen between Prussia and Austria-Hungary, or Germany and Austria-Hungary rather. And so they ally with each other as a reaction against the fear that these guys are starting to kind of instill in the rest of Europe at this time. So, and here you can see some imagery from the time that demonstrates the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Here you can see the allied powers of Great Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Montenegro, Belgium, and Serbia. And then over on the right, another image there of Britain, France, and Russia, and Belgium, it looks like, on the bottom. And then, flags and friends who fight in freedom's cause. This was another image here demonstrating the nations involved. This is the era of flags, by the way, now. Flags are really very much a nationalistic sort of a thing. And different nations have different flags, and they are symbolic and usually represent different ideas on the flag. And so that's why probably really for the first time ever we're seeing the use of a lot of flag imagery here. Major sign of nationalism, flags are. All right, here's another image for you, just again to kind of demonstrate for you these different alliances. So in blue here, we've got France, Britain, and Russia. Why are these in blue down here? Because remember, at the time, these are French colonies. Okay, so France controls these areas down here. And then over here you have Spain, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, which are all going to remain neutral. All right, they're all going to remain neutral, along with Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania. Turkey ends up, and technically I guess Romania and Bulgaria do as well. These nations over here end up joining the conflict after it starts. So in 1914 they weren't in the war yet, but by the time that 1915 rolls around, they've gotten dragged into the conflict. But anyhow, this kind of gives you the lay of the land here. Now, Russia had some allies that were not technically part of the Triple Entente, okay, but they were nonetheless allied with the French, the Russians, and the British. And this is really unique because Britain had absolutely no interest in Serbia. They could have cared less what happened in Serbia. But they do care about their own navy, and for that reason, they are just as concerned as ever about Germany gaining too much power and upsetting the balance of power in Europe at this time. So this is kind of the political scheme of things before the war starts. This is why this is so significant, is because when the war breaks out, these alliances, it's kind of like, imagine that you were like, in like a web or a net, okay? If you were caught in a net with like 5 other people, and one person gets pushed over a cliff, all of you who are tangled in the net are going to get dragged over, okay? Because you're all in this interconnected web of alliances. And so what happens when the war actually starts, even though Britain didn't really have anything to do with the war starting, Britain ends up getting dragged into the war because they're chained to France, which is chained to Russia, which is chained to Serbia, and Serbia ends up, so it's a huge chain reaction. These alliances create a chain reaction where every single nation basically gets pulled into this conflict, despite the fact that none of them really had anything to do with what actually kicked the war off. So, long-term causes of World War I. Another cause is militarism. So I mentioned earlier in class today the Anglo-German arms race. Whenever you see that word Anglo, it just means English. Okay, so English-German arms race. And this German arms race is basically where militarism, which is the, militarism, obviously the root word being military. When we think about militarism, it's the process of building up a military and expanding that military and using that military to exert national power. And so militarism led to a belief in the inevitability of a general European war at this time, and Germany had been developing industrially since about the 1860s, 1870s. By the time that they get to the 1890s, Germany had actually overtaken Britain in terms of its level of industrialization. Remember, we learned that Britain was the first to industrialize. But I mentioned to you when we were learning about the Industrial Revolution that there was actually a second Industrial Revolution that happens late in the 1800s that Germany and America were at the forefront of. What this means is that basically Germany now is the most powerful European industrialized nation. They are building cars. By this point, Mercedes-Benz is already a company. Okay, Mercedes starts making some of the first automobiles in Europe. All right, mass-produced automobiles in Europe. And then in America, Henry Ford starts doing the same thing shortly thereafter. All right, Germany ends up overtaking Britain industrially. Germany is also at the forefront industrially of military technology. They are building new ship designs. They're building new things like zeppelins, which are blimps. Okay, they're building what else? New engine designs, armored vehicles, weapons, like guns, bombs, mines, all sorts of things. And so the Germans, by the time that we get to the 1890s, the Germans are quite an industrialized nation, and they are using their industrialization to promote expanding and building up their military. Now, it's not that Britain isn't doing the same thing. Britain is doing precisely that as well. But the thing with Britain is that they had trouble. Britain had trouble with like keeping innovative. British engineering just wasn't as innovative as German engineering was. And so the British, they had failed to kind of keep updating their factories and their machines. And so by the time that you get to about the 1860s, 1870s in Britain, a lot of their factories are kind of outdated. They're using old equipment, and they're not quite as up to date as the Germans are. But the Germans are really hostile, particularly during the age of imperialism. And so the Germans basically start to threaten to develop a fleet that rivals the British Royal Navy. Now, the British Royal Navy's policy was that its fleet was supposed to be larger than the combined fleets of any two rival nations. Meaning that if you took France and Germany and you added both of their fleets together, that the British Navy would still be larger than both of them combined. That was their policy. That was the British shipbuilding policy. When the Germans come out and say, hey, we're going to start building ships that are equal in number to Britain, Britain freaks out. Because why would Germany do that unless they had an intention of going to war with Britain? And so the British freak out over the Germans' threat to expand their navy to equal the British Royal Navy's size. Bertha von Suttner was the first woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize by opposing this German-English naval arms race that had been developing. She wrote a piece called Lay Down Your Arms in 1889, which contributed to the founding of peace societies in Austria and Germany leading up to World War I. Unfortunately, their messages would fall on deaf ears. But in 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser just means like king or ruler. Kaiser Wilhelm II, it means like emperor. Kaiser comes from the word Caesar. König means king in German. But anyway, Kaiser Wilhelm II began the expansion of the German Navy to protect a growing international trade and colonial empire that Germany was trying to establish. And he puts Alfred von Tirpitz in charge, who was an admiral who led the naval buildup for Germany. In 1912, there was something known as the Haldane Mission, which was where Britain tried unsuccessfully to end the naval arms race with Germany and hopefully prevent or forego having to end up going to war with one another, but it does not work. And by the time that 1914 breaks out, both Britain and Germany possessed dreadnought-class battleships, which is pictured in the background of this slide here, which is a much more modern, up-to-date style battleship, which was a huge ship with heavy cannons and extreme heavy metal armor plating and that kind of thing. And so these super battleships with awesome firing range and power, could ultimately have really done some significant damage in the war. What's interesting is you don't see a lot of damage done from the Navy, though. In World War I, the Navy is not particularly effective in terms of doing damage to the other side. Except for U-boats. U-boats are the exception to that. But in terms of battleships, we don't really see battleships take the role that both Germany and Britain thought that they were going to in World War I. So why didn't they just use air troops and hit the Navy? That's a really smart idea. That's what they're going to do in World War II. The reason they don't do it in World War I is because airplanes have only barely been invented by the time that World War I breaks out. And so the technology wasn't good enough. Planes' distance, the range that they could fly was very, very short. Also, the planes themselves were really like a stiff wind would have blown them out of the sky. They were pretty fragile. And so planes of World War I are used, but in a limited fashion, and they're used more on land than they are on water. Yeah, they're pretty much noobs at this time. You're not wrong about that. But nonetheless, they do have some technology that is going to cause a tremendous amount of devastation to the European countryside. So these battleships do not end up doing the damage that they thought that they were going to, but they do some damage in the sense that they're able to counter the U-boats that are stalking the waters of the Atlantic. All right, so that brings us through M and A in terms of mania, militarism, and alliances. And now let's just really briefly recap by talking about imperialism. Remember that imperialism had led to increased tensions between the great powers over Africa. And that was really where the Berlin Conference had come into place in 1884-85, where Germany, led by the late Otto von Bismarck, got Germany into the imperialism game and started establishing rules for carving up Africa. And we looked at this image before. This should look familiar to you. Germany aggressively at that time set out to acquire colonies, sometimes even coming into conflict with rival European powers who were concerned about just how ferociously Germany was fighting to acquire these territories. And there was something in 1902 known as the Kruger Telegram, which triggered British anger at Germany when the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, by this point Otto von Bismarck has been fired, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, congratulated the Boers down in South Africa on their victory over the British troops. Now, in case you're wondering, like, what the heck, I thought that the Boers lost to the British. They did, okay? The Kruger Telegram was deliberately designed to just anger Britain for congratulating the Boers on a victory that the British had actually won over the Boers. And so it's a thing that's just deliberately, when I was growing up, I'm just going to do a hard right turn here. Uh, when I was growing up, there was a kid in our neighborhood. His name was Paul. And I don't know if you had this experience growing up in your neighborhood, but Paul was like the kid in the neighborhood who uh, nobody in the neighborhood really liked him, but because he was like in the neighborhood, you were kind of forced to hang out with him. And so, everybody just really didn't like Paul because he was just the worst. He was just the worst. But Germany becomes like the Paul of the neighborhood of Europe. Okay? Germany is just really aggravating, really antagonistic, really provoking other people for really no good reason other than they can. Okay, and that's what makes them so frustrating to the British, because the British are trying to establish stability with their colonial empire, and seemingly the Germans keep on interfering in other nations' business. And it's like, Germany, what are you doing? Just chill out and stop being so annoying. All right, but they just can't help themselves. In 1906, just a few years later, there was something known as the Algeciras Conference, and this settled what was known as the First Moroccan Crisis. And what was the Moroccan Crisis, you ask? Well, it was when Kaiser Wilhelm had urged Moroccan independence despite the fact that Morocco was a French colony. And so what Germany is doing here is trying to get the Moroccans to revolt against the French and establish their independence. And the French are looking over at Germany like, what are you doing? This isn't even your colony. Mind your own business. Just let us handle our affairs here. And the Germans are like, no, we want more colonies and we want you to have less colonies. And so the Germans are just trying to, like, what the heck are you, the French are just like trying to manage their colonies just like the British were. And here come the Germans meddling, in their affairs again. So Britain and Italy supported French dominance in Morocco and Tunisia. So Britain, France, Russia, and the United States all begin at this time to see Germany as a potential threat to dominate all of Europe. Germany, after this Algeciras conference settling the Moroccan crisis, Germany became further isolated with the exception of Austria's support. Austria is Germany's only friend. It's like the friend in the neighborhood that just pushed everybody too far, and now they only have like one person that they can go to hang out with because everybody else hates them. That was Germany. And their only other friend was Austria at this time. At this time, Germany also then, keep in mind Germany is isolated because everybody's angry at them for the way that they've been behaving. But leave it to Germany, to the minute that they become isolated, that they start pouting about it. You guys are being mean to me. Oh, you're being so mean to me. Okay? And they start crying out, oh, you guys are encircling us. You're trying to block our emergence as a world power. And they start to get all fussy and whiny about things. And the Triple Entente is created precisely in response to Germany and its growing, growing influence, we'll say, or its upsetting of the balance of power of Europe by all of its provocative behavior in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But folks, that is where we will leave the lecture off today. I covered a whole lot of information, so I hope that you were listening very closely, and we will pick it up there next time as we continue our unit on World War I. Have a wonderful Tuesday.